Hi and welcome along to what I can't believe now is our 18th conversation. Already got 17 recorded and online, and delighted now to be joined by Jonathan Ware, who is a military historian. And if I were to try and summarise up Jonathan's interests and expertise, I would look towards the 53rd Welsh Division, the Normandy campaign and the interwar period as well. But Jonathan can confirm that or deny that in a second or two when he says hello and he introduces himself.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Ware. I'm a military historian who specialises in 53rd Welsh Division, the Normandy campaign and interwar stuff, really. So it's a bit eclectic, but it's also quite focused. You've got to do for me, you've got to do the deep dive, and that's where all the really great stuff comes out.
Jonathan, first question that I ask absolutely everyone is about their memories of studying history when they were at school. So is there anything that stands out for you?
I was lucky to have some really good teachers. I wasn't always the best pupil. I was caught playing Sudden Strike. I don't know if you ever played that on my computer, because I got to use a computer in class. So in retrospect, when you're playing a World War II game during a civil rights class, you can tell where your interest is going to take you. I went to a St Albans school, and I had two teachers, Edward Bevington and Mr Martin, who I can't remember his first name, and they were fantastic. Now, what I thought was interesting though at school was we tended to do the same topic again and again and again. Now that helps you boost. For anyone watching here wondering how schools supercharge their grades, is because you do the same topic 40, 50 times. We did certain ones. I think the unification of Germany and civil rights came up quite a lot. And for me, I've got more interested in civil rights stuff of late when doing Second World War stuff on African-American soldiers, because a lot of that context was lost when you're just studying the civil rights movement in isolation. And when I started studying the Welsh Division later on, again, that was interesting because I wondered how these weird stories about soldiers fighting slot into the bigger picture. When I was at school, I was quite lucky. There's a good library, and there was a book in there on interwar light tank development. Now, anyone watching this, you find one of these weird books. It all looks like Heath Robinson cartoons drawn on the back of a fag packet. Really, really bizarre. And it was flicking through that at home really helped drive it. When we were at school as well, the curious thing was we learned a lot of First World War history through war poetry. Now, I remember thinking it was really weird that we're learning about war and the past through English classes, and there wasn't at the time any other subject taught in the same way. And that's just odd, because we were looking at the literature devoid of any of the context of where the people came from, their culture. And at the time, I remember thinking this was bizarre. Moving ahead then, it became a lot more, when I got more interested in the Second World War, I started realising how weird that was, because we were trying to analyse poetry with our modern views on it. And it would have been great to have more history, but we glossed over that. This was the period when the First World War and Second World War still aren't really covered. A lot of the time, they don't crop up too much. We did the rise of Nazi Germany quite a lot, which again, does prove useful later in life, yet less useful for me or exciting at the time. That said, though, we went on a few great school trips. So when I had the luxury of going to Monte Cassino when I was 18, and that blew my mind. And I picked up about half a dozen books before going there, read it, guided a segment on the coach for the school group. As an 18-year-old is, in retrospect, a bit odd. But it was really interesting. And to see the ground and explore it in a way, even for just a day, really gave me an appreciation for military history, which stuck with. I thought what was fascinating, though, is the great teacher will inspire you. So I was humoured with one of my lectures on interwar Germany with the Nazi Soviet pact by looking at tank development. Now, in retrospect, I know everything I wrote was complete rubbish. There was nothing accurate in it at all. It all looked right if you looked at the tanks pictures and stuff, but the accuracy wasn't there. But again, I was encouraged by teachers to dig further. So by the time then it came to course selection, I started looking at war studies and war and society over, say, something like a history degree, because I wanted to specialise relatively early. Because also you're not really covering this at school. Military history is a great church because it's so broad. It's basically everything in social history boiled together. You throw morality and ethics in constantly, and then you've got tactics. You can war game it and stuff. But because you got this such a diverse melting pot, it's not as many people see it as like a tiny, some people say it's a separate subject. It is social history. Anyone who says it isn't, I think it's just wrong. You've got gender studies in there. You've got all these different topics just boiled down. Whereas for me, the First World War was very different. When I read the literature to that at school, I found it quite dull. It was a lot of Owen was pushed at us, and Brooke and stuff. And I didn't relate to that. When I looked at the Second World War stuff, I found these people felt a lot more like myself. And obviously there was the First World War causes this cultural sort of revolution to an extent. So yeah, but fantastic teachers. Bevington definitely nurtured my interest, as did Martin. And I was awful on coursework, but they would always encourage me through it. And even if I did, I mean, some of it was atrocious. I did my project in one night for my A2s, which is not to be done. But again, they always encouraged, were always patient. When I was at primary school, we did go to France, and actually in secondary school as well, and we did look at some of the battlefields then. My mum never let me play with toy guns as a kid, so going and looking at the battlefields, I do put a lot of my interest down to not being allowed to play with the toys. Going and look at them was again interesting because it was something which I didn't really see, didn't really experience. And then when I was at school, actually, two of the more interesting points were we had the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings in 1994. And then obviously that's the 60th later on. And we had Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan, that sort of stuff. And the more media that came out about this, I was encapsulated by, because again, it's something I hadn't come across. It was also just the right time for these events to become the past. So we started exploring them in a whole new way and talking about them in a very different way. There was also a fantastic talk at St Albans from a chap who had been a messenger or a dispatch rider, and he had to go up Gold or Sword Beach on 16 during the Overlord landings. And he was talking about that, and I was encapsulated by it. I thought, this is stunning stuff. And then only later on do you realise how this guides you down that path. So yeah, my interest was military stuff. Bevington was also in the cadets, so I joined the school cadet force and learned chunks through that. But because it was harder to access, I just would end up picking up odds and sods of books. Yes, you could go online and Google it, but it wasn't as easy as it is now. In some ways, actually, it's a bit harder now because there's so much out there. There's a lot of bad stuff. You've got to be quite careful what you pick up. But yeah, it was great to sort of pick it up by chance because it wasn't on the curriculum really. You sort of had to come to it slightly later. Although, I mean, like Bevington was a very keen military historian, and Martin was very, very keen on his sort of stuff. So you would flick through Kershaw and bits like that. The one thing I would say was I found AS and A2 quite repetitive. So when I wanted to study history, I wanted to study more than I was looking at, and I didn't feel so engaged by a lot of the topics at the time. In retrospect, though, I mean, learning about Nazi Germany 4 times, 5 times was obviously of use eventually, and civil rights and stuff does obviously have some leanings into American oppression, so in the Second World War and segregation. But if you, one problem for me is if you want to study something at university and you're not quite engaged with it yet, it may come later. And it's one of the interesting things with history. Loads of people will come to it from different walks of life. And you may desperately want to grab that little bit, that kernel, but you may not be able to. So you sort of have to weasel your way through. But the subject's always interesting because what you're studying is human experience. And ultimately reading enough, learning enough, and it just absorbing like a sponge enough angles, you do learn stuff. So lots of stuff about methodology I learned at school and started thinking about. Detaching personal accounts from the historical context. Again, all these things you suddenly look at 20 years later, you're like, oh, I can see where that came from. So that side of it is still fascinating and continues to intrigue me. So.
Jonathan, curious, given the fact that you're a military historian, and just wondered, what does that actually entail? What does your job involve?
COVID sort of trashed a lot of stuff. I would say this is, what it is isn't what I imagined it would be. So a lot of it's archival work. That's the first stage. So you need to visit archives all over the country and potentially elsewhere. if you can't go elsewhere, you need mates who can. So then you sort of set up this horse trading arrangement with people all over the world to slide each other copies of books, photograph pages here and there. And if you're not helpful, you won't get stuff. So you've got to really be honest about it as well. You can't hoard material. So you've always got to be willing to be available and help people out. It may not help you there and then, but usually 6 to 12 months or maybe a couple of years down the line. One of the interesting things is I am not always the most organized person. When you're researching a topic, you need to get a rough idea. My ridiculous life started with basically a Google whack. So in many ways, unexpected discovery can take you down this path. So what I always do is go online, look it up, go and Google, have a flick about. You may find answers presenting themselves. If you're ever looking at a topic and you get something like less than 20 Google results, Google whacking obviously is harder now because so much more content. There is a story why there is not a story online. There should be content about topics. The Welsh Division started with it was four results I had on a Google search about 53rd Welsh Division in 2007 or 8, and I found that really odd. So the first thing you want to do is have an idea, and if you stumble across it by chance, the lack of why something's there may be the indicator there's something really bigger going on. Then you need to work out where you're standing. So I pull down and I will go through tons and tons and tons and tons of books. And when you're mining them, go to the bibliographies, try and trace the material back. And once you've started doing that, then you can start looking at archive work. When you go to archives, always be lovely to archivists. They're brilliant people by and large. A mate of mine watching this probably will shout at me if I don't say that. But again, you've got to work with them and they've got to work with you. They want to supply you the material. Often enough, you'll find stuff's been miscatalogued. Some documents at Kew vanished for 40 years because they were labelled under 34 Tank Brigade, for example, not Tank Brigade. So it never showed up on any of these search parameters. Go figure. So you've got to be willing to help staff, talk to them, check paper catalogues. All this will suck up time. Once you've done that, you can try and track down veterans. One of the worst things I found was lots of my attempts to get interviews were blocked, and I got blocked on various provincial reasons here and there, small groups of people not wanting to do that. And you think that your plan, your project, your idea is big and everyone should get involved. Most people probably don't care. So you want to try and sell it to them. And if they still don't buy it, that's fine. That really is fine because you've got your own idea, you've got your own approach. People probably won't steal it. So once you've started looking at the material, it then comes to sort of trying to write it. And often enough, I've ended up with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of words of material I've not been able to use. It could be a mix of reasons, it could be legal reasons you can't quote. Poetry is an absolute pain. And one of the weirdest things, I didn't think I'd have to learn so much about the law of copyright and so on as an independent. That is a side topic for another day, but it all comes down to just because something's great doesn't mean annoyingly you can always use it. But this also then damages our view of the past. When you get close to a Google whack, as I did, one of the key things we need, a bloke called Lonnie Bunch, who's head of the Smithsonian, talks about the diversity of ideas. So if you think you've got a new idea, most people don't think like that. Most people don't dive for new ideas. We try and recycle the old stuff. But when you have a new idea, it's probably best to grab it and harness it. So I've got written down here about 5 or 6 other great ideas of research, but will they ever see the light of day? I put one online, I revealed one recently. I went to an archive, I found this amazing story about a heavy anti-aircraft regiment. And it was told from a civilian perspective about these people who set a civilian association up to help the homeless and the disadvantaged in the 30s. So it's all relevant to recession and all this sort of stuff. And they used it as a social tool to help raise people out and give them a sense of pride and community. When in the run-up to war, a lot of the men, they joined a heavy anti-aircraft regiment, and they wanted to defend their city and their people and their friends and their families. And as this association grown, more women had joined it, more men had joined it, and it became a very middle class and also working class organisation, having galas and also organising holidays for people. But they would pay like a penny basically for a holiday for them and their family. It was all very nominal. And they got sent to Java, and the vast majority of them died. They died in hell ships or in prisoner of war camps and so on. I think 2 or 3 returned to the UK. but of the 2 or 3, one of them writes a scrapbook, and you're trying to reconstruct this astonishing story from a scrapbook and a smattering of war diary references and stuff. It's exceptionally hard because you can have the best idea in the world, but if the source material is not there, what do you do? And that's one of the interesting calls. You've got to make complex decisions on minimal data. So one of the problems I ran into is an infantry battalion of 800 men. When I started this, I assumed loads of people spoke about combat because I've seen Saving Private Ryan. They base bits of it. As a kid, you're thinking this is really realistic when it's not so much. Band of Brothers as well, I read and devoured by Ambrose. And you're thinking, all these interviews. In Britain, we didn't really go down that path. The BBC's People War Archive is great, but it's hard to search nowadays. I actually printed off a copy of it because the search function is so unreliable, and it may eventually just sort of die into the ether of the internet. So we didn't commemorate or talk to our veterans in the way the Americans did. It wasn't in many ways such a seminal event. Some people can disagree with me, but the data's just not there. So of an infantry battalion of 800 men, we may be looking at sometimes as low as 1 or 2 accounts, which is atrocious, to base narrative off about what people have done, what their experiences were, what their thoughts were. And what really happened, you trust the documentation you're looking at. So it can be as low as 0.05% of accounts. So you can be dealing with very tiny amounts of information, having to extrapolate massive things. I used to trust a lot of the big name historians when I started this, but I was curious because it was so tricky because I was trying to work out why the Welsh Division wasn't cropping up at all. And then you realise that people are massaging quotes here and there, using material in German and putting it into English, which when you read the original German has a completely different meaning. So one of the problems is, as an independent, you've got to try and get an idea of where everyone else stands, or the broad view, and then try and work out where you come into this. So what are you trying to say? Also, has someone said it before? I handed over a book topic to a mate of mine recently because I thought he could express it better than I could. And when you're several independents working together, that can happen. And if you both write the same book and publish it within a year of each other, you're going to say the same sort of stuff because the availability of material is the same sort of maths. You swap the same sort of notes. So lots of archival work. The legal stuff, to include photographs, can be a nightmare. And one thing which I was always curious about was I always thought that museums would operate and archives in a way to promote the past. And I'm rather cynical on this for many reasons, but a lot of them aren't. Again, a lot of people aren't interested in what you're writing on. And then when you want to try and take it to a broader audience, if you're working with muted narratives or want to promote a new diverse approach, many people will go, well, that doesn't fit our little view of the world. It doesn't. You want to use loads of images? No, you can't do that. You want to include tons of quotes? No, you can't do that. So you have to constantly try and find ways around these problems. My way around the problem was to write 470,000 word book in 2 volumes, which is insane. I don't recommend it for anyone. But again, you've got to broaden your view. You've got to deal with people. You've got to deal with publishers. My publisher was very patient. And just it's lots of hours on the phone, online, calling people up, turning up at collections, being told there's material. You'll open the page and you'll find four pieces. Open a booklet and find 4 pieces of material, something like that. So you've got to be very patient. Which again, I surprisingly am. I shouldn't be, but I can be. So it's very different to what I envisaged. I used to think that historians would sit down, crack through tons of material, and then after a while you realise that most of it's not online. We've got some great stuff digitised, but just because it's digitised doesn't mean it's the stuff you want. And just because, again, it's the stuff you want, what haven't they digitised? So what are you not seeing? And that's a real challenge. So you've got to learn then how archives work. You've got to learn how museums work, learn about different cultures, and try and operate within them. And I would say it's less easy to do now than it was 10 years ago. It's got a lot harder. Most archives and museums are doing fewer opening hours or restricting documents, which means this all takes a lot longer. Which again isn't then good for highlighting muted topics or diverse topics, because they're already more costly to bring to the fore, to highlight and explore. And then you're adding more barriers. I don't understand the logic of it, other than, either people don't want it or complex topics are complex to convey. We live in complex times. We need great commentary. We need brilliant history from different people with diverse voices. You keep hearing people say it, but if you look at what's coming out, it often isn't there. I sort of have written, in many ways, the book I would have wanted to read, but I probably would have never sat down and read it. So yeah, you've got to think, if your idea is good enough, does it hold legs? Moving forward, I have been pulling together more research work on other projects. I've been looking at campaign histories of Normandy, other histories of the campaign, interwar rearmament stuff, because your interest sort of grows. A lot of historians will focus, say, on the strategic history, but not tactical or operational, or then won't look at gender history, won't look at the personal accounts and so on to the same level. And for me, I think you have to mesh it all together. And that's where I think really complex, interesting answers and questions start forming and percolating when you're writing. And then how much do you comment when you're writing this stuff? Are you conveying? So some people would argue that more as a chronicler, or are you more when you analyse material? Stephen Ambrose was described as writing history that made people feel great. If you look at the accuracy of his work, it's often lacking. He made up a 2-volume or 3-volume history on Eisenhower's memoirs, which was exposed in the New Yorker. He just created interviews, basically. So you've got to be constantly critical of the material you're looking at, and also asking yourself, is it good enough?
Jonathan, the subject of your book that you've already mentioned is, of course, the 53rd Welsh in the Second World War. Just curious to know, just maybe a bit about the research into the division itself and things that you've been looking at.
So that started with the Google work, and for me, I mean, I go on about muted narratives quite a lot, and because that's how I stumbled on the topic. So a mate of mine, I was doing reenacting at the time, I was starting getting some gear together, and he said, let's reenact a Welsh unit, because I went to unit Swansea, and I went, all right, cool, yeah, that sounds great. Okay, why don't we do a 53rd Welsh Division? I said, oh, okay, cool. Wales had a division, all right. What can I read on it? So I don't know. So I went online and got 4 results. I thought, this is really weird. This is a formation of 18,000 men that fights through Normandy all the way to the end of the war. So how do they vanish? So I went out and bought a ton of books, and a ton of books. And I kept finding them in the back of the book in the order of battle, which is where they list all the formations who fight in a campaign. And then in the prose, there would be a bit here or there. And I found actually 1 or 2 bits were removed from them due to legal challenges, which is quite interesting due to other historians' work. And I thought, this is so odd. How do you vanish from history? And obviously for me, this is generally a punchy topic right now, how entire groups can be written out of history. So then what I did is I started buying books on formation. So I picked up Patrick Delaforce's book, went through that, found the bibliography quite useful. And then I picked up a few other books, and sometimes I'd find the weirdest thing where a bloke would be called a lieutenant and he was actually a lance corporal. So you wouldn't be able to trace the archive it came from. And so as an undergrad, I start running around trying to pull more and more material on them together. And it's sort of ultimately, this destroys my life many years later and leads to my career, really. But the thing I kept finding was there was loads of material on them, but it wasn't necessarily looked at. And I couldn't understand how they got written out because it didn't make any sense. The Battle of Normandy was portrayed. I mean, it's only in the last sort of 10 years we've stopped looking at the Germans as being the superior force in Normandy. It's always struck me as a bit of a weird maths underpinning it, that 2 + 2 = 5. So the Germans have better guns, the Germans have better tanks, the Germans have better troops, the Germans are smarter and more intelligent than the Allies, so the Germans lose the campaign. All right. And it's this sort of stuff which is so weird. And that was a dominating narrative, starting really with Max Hastings. It does go a bit before that, in the 80s, and it still carries through. I mean, many of the historians who argued that consulted on literally hundreds of documentaries. And when I was at school in the 2000s, there was a series called Weaponology and stuff you may have watched, and other things on History Channel, lots of them. They have the same core, when you look back on it, of consultants who push the same views, who are all doing very well financially from it at the time, but they're not really pushing good history, frankly. So I started really diving into the topic then. I started going for veteran interviews, and that's why I learned that not everyone may want to talk to you. And I had a few interviews get blocked. I got a few great ones, and then a couple got lost according to hard drive failures and stuff. So because I was using digital tech as a student, you don't always luck in. But yeah, over time it became more interest that they were fought in Normandy. They landed between, I'm going to get the dates wrong myself, it's like the 24th, I believe, to about the 29th of June 1944. So they're right after D-Day. There were stories they were there on D-Day. They weren't. There were more Welsh soldiers on D-Day than everyone says. But again, what do we deem a Welsh soldier, for example, is an interesting topic, and a Welsh unit. And then once they get committed to the Battle of Normandy, they fight in several major battles. They're fighting Operation Epsom, which is the first big battle, Hill 112. They fight in Operation Green Line, which is an absolutely titanic showdown. And they fight all the way to Falaise and stuff. But all this stuff pretty much was not being mentioned in any of the other histories. So I tracked down more of the memoirs and this sort of stuff. And I mean, I've probably got about 1,000 books on the Normandy campaign now, something stupid. I started going to Brecon, the Royal Welsh Museum in Brecon, is now known as that. And their archival collections were really useful because I was fairly local. I could pop there quite a lot, and the staff got to go and know me quite well. And I'm very, very grateful to them. And then after going to them for quite a lot, I started going to the National Archives at Kew and digging up material. And back when I started this, I didn't have a camera phone. I had a camera, but it wasn't convinced. It would kill my computer to fill it up with images. So I transcribed 25,000 words a day at Kew or somewhere, just typing down desperately material to analyse later. And from that, I started to build up what for me was a big question going. It looked more and more that the British narrative of the campaign was at odds with what historians were arguing. And if that's the case, how's that happened? Am I insane? Because I didn't understand that what I was seeing from source material was so different from what had been written for the last 30 years. Luckily at the time, John Buckley, David French, and a few others were writing on it. And there were a few other books by, probably going to say David French again, Stephen Napier and stuff, where these people were looking a little bit more, just with a little bit more detail at the campaign. Timothy Harris in place for one training. And all this stuff is coming out when I'm doing this research, or just before, so I'm tracking it down. And it starts making me go, actually, perhaps I'm not off here. Perhaps I'm actually on point more than off. And the reason was the one thing I found as a smoking gun to start with was there's a huge tank battle in Normandy called Operation Goodwood, where we throw 3 armoured divisions smack bang wallop into the Germans. And it was always written by historians that this was a breakout attempt and it failed. Big drama, how incompetent the British, all this sort of stuff, how excellent German tanks were. But what I kept finding was there were 3 major offensives by the British before that, involving tens of thousands of soldiers in the days before that. And even the documentation would say notes on operations 15 to 17 July. So all this material and from the was building up. And then the craziest thing started happening, which is accounts by figures such as Mark Dempsey that was said not to exist. Turns out some of them did exist in certain archives. And then you're reading the commanders and you're checking then their phone conversations. So when you do it on a small enough level, you can trace who's in what meeting. And it's one of the problems with Eisenhower. Oh, generals lie. There's a spoiler. Generals lie the whole time in their memoirs. You can't trust them. But Ike lies. Bradley lies. Monty lies. Dempsey never writes a memoir, so he can't technically lie. You've just got his diary to go off and what notes his his secretary, who may or may not have been his mistress, left, because she burnt a lot of them. And you have to sort of do this forensic reconstruction. And for me, it started framing the Welsh Division as being written out where after the war, we wanted to study how to defeat the Soviets. So this becomes something about the Cold War. So we looked at battlefield studies that would help us analyse that. And attacks and offensives where the British did okay or achieved certain goals didn't really feature into this. And later on, there's a thing with battlefield tours the army ran, where we started inviting German officers on, and these German commanders would portray better and better stories. There's a chap called Hans von Luck, and his memoirs become more and more embellished, and his battlefield stories definitely do if you talk to people who are on the early ones with him. And the reason was he was earning so much money on tours and publishing. He had every reason to show himself as being this great protagonist of the battle who saves the day, because that's his career post-war. It's a really important part of it. It sort of becomes this great military figure. When it was then exposed by Ian Dalglish, again, all at the same time this is happening, I'm looking into it. Dalglish wrote an excellent book where he pointed out lots of the core stuff Hans von Luck's claims happened, never did. The guns weren't there. You couldn't have done this von Luck. You must be 5 miles away, just off basic timings and so on. So the more I dug into the military side, I got more interested in the civilian side. So who is the Welsh soldier? And we have to go back to the First World War to look at their parents a bit, and then the interwar period. So I was amazed to learn that in 1919, this is now more common knowledge, but in 1919 there were race riots in Cardiff. In 1911 we had anti-Jewish riots in Tredegar. And by the time the British Union and the fascists come around, they're actually banned from spreading anti-Semitism in Cardiff. So when they have a rally, they can't really promote their views because they can't discuss their key point, which is quite interesting. And they get that banned by the chief constable, who bizarrely enough was alleged to be a racist as well against the black community in Cardiff. So, and one of the wider points I have been looking into is, where do all the black British soldiers from Cardiff go in the Second World War? Because there's a lot of them who, again, many black Britons would have gone to serve in the Merchant Navy and the Navy and stuff, because Cardiff is a seaport, and Bute Town and Tiger Bay were major maritime ports of the city. I believe the most diverse place in the UK is something like 40, 50 languages spoken at the time or more, that sort of stuff, and used for propaganda to show how people were coming together in adverse circumstances. But you start wondering where those people are going. And I mean, the source material I was dealing with Welsh soldiers was so sparse. In some cases, one unit, I've only got about 4 accounts from Max, and that's scrabbling all this stuff together. And that regimental museum never got back to me for about 6 years, which is really weird, because again, you keep calling them up and you never get the phone call back and emailing, which I don't understand, because surely you want your collections being promoted. And by exploring then who they were, where they come from, I then wanted to know more about the Germans there, the opposition. So in some cases in my book, I've been really lucky to find the account of British soldier A and German soldier B who are effectively shooting at each other. And their motivations and stuff, it very rarely comes up, sometimes does. And I wanted to explore then, just look at the two sides. The British create, to my mind, professional soldiers who treat it as a job. And the Germans are trying to create this, through the SS at least, of warriors to fight in many ways. And warrior culture is quite a big deal if you look at how their formations are training and what they're doing. And you see these incidents. In some sort of cases, you have the British soldiers recalling their conversations with Germans rather fluently, and stacking up with other accounts of people who were there. So I wanted to then, what started as a really simple thing, going, why has the Welsh Division been forgotten? I hate to use the F word, but it basically was. The minute it's a Google whack, it's a topic to be explored. And go, let's shine a light on this. Then go, who were they? Who were these people? Looking at the home front stuff, looking at relationships is always tricky because of letters home and things. A Welsh division included soldiers from England, Scotland, Wales, some from Northern Ireland. They were sent to Northern Ireland 39 to 41. Many of them married Northern Irish girls. And so occasionally you get material cropping up in really odd places. They had a mix of Canadian, Dutch, Free Dutch, Free Norwegian officers off the top of my head, and more. So it becomes a cultural melting pot. Welsh soldiers, before they go to Normandy, are playing baseball. And there's sort of this cultural, a lot of the class divides are actually breaking down if you look at things. People who say I'm wrong are free to, but then you need to dig far deeper into the source material to look at it, because it doesn't always say what we expect from our approaches, which I find fascinating. So yeah, and then obviously the book runs through Normandy and comes towards Falaise and the Battle of the Falaise Gap. But again, the Welsh soldiers were completely written out of that, because we tend to view the Normandy campaign through certain stages, and the final stage of it is seen as a Canadian, Polish engagement, and even the American involvement in the closing the Falaise Gap is often downplayed somewhat, because these are confusing battles, and all the generals, by the way, for that stage are lying. Every last one of them is lying in memoirs. So you've got to try and go, none of you are telling the truth. So where do we start? And then you've got to go back to the source material to reconstruct those meetings. I was stunned also when writing this, because you're trying to work out why troops are doing what they're doing, what commanders are ordering. Eisenhower suffered very badly with mental health problems throughout the campaign. He struggled to sleep, he suffered tinnitus. he was shaking, and he was chain smoking and drinking as well. And there were serious concerns about his health. And then you look at mental health and provisions in regards to that sort of stuff as well. So you keep broadening it out. So my aim was to write a book that looked at the experience of Welsh Division action, but all these other topics boiled in, basically. And I hope that I've done that, and it'll be out in early 2021 because it's COVID delayed. But I think it's something new. I think it highlights so many diverse, marginalised narratives. We're great as a country of promoting the same stuff again and again, but we all keep saying we want to hear new stuff, and people find new history exciting. Well, let's produce some more of it. It's a lot more hard work. It'll take a lot longer. If I was writing a generic Normandy history, you could probably pump it out in 6 months to a year or so. If you're doing a more marginalised, smaller, niche narrative, you can times that by 4, times that by 5, and all the associated costs. So yeah, that's quite a challenge at the moment. But yeah, so hopefully it does the soldiers of that division justice, and also look at the French side as well.
Jonathan, just before we have to finish our conversation, just curious if anyone is, listening to this or watching this, and they themselves they're perhaps interested in a career in history. Is there any advice that you would give to them? Yeah,
history needs diverse ideas to explore mutant narratives. If you have a new idea, pursue it. The odds are, if you're a kid listening to this or a student, you probably actually have had a new idea. Most people don't tend to come up with new ideas as often as you would expect. Lonnie Bunch, who now runs the Smithsonian, he coined the phrase diversity of ideas. He said there's a problem, we don't have these diverse ideas. And I think it's accurate. I think it's true. There are so many barriers, like in certain schools of thought, they call them structural violence. So if you want to write on a muted topic, you're going to have to look harder, dive deeper. So you'll find currently that you can maybe access 10 documents from the National Archives any day. I was able to access between 100 to 120 a day with a digital camera, so I could then blitz through the material and look at it later. This is the 21st century. It's a digital economy we're meant to run on, and then other archives are currently closed or gatekeeping access. And COVID's made this all worse. But generally speaking, we've been moving towards less access. Mates of mine who are archivists, though, they are committed to increasing access. I know many institutions who I can't name here because I've consulted with them and stuff and things, but they are committed to increasing access, and then they're looking at digitisation and stuff. One of the bigger problems we have is that if you want to write on colonial history, you have to come to London. Now, we need to have a talk as a country about how we access our heritage. Is that appropriate that as a post-colonial country who had an empire, that researchers from around the world have to come here because they can't access it online? All that material should be freely available online for everyone to access, especially if we're truly committed to diverse narratives. I'm not sure many places are as committed as they say for their soundbites, sadly. I would say it's often going to be frustrating. You're going to run into tons and tons and tons of dead ends. You will run into more dead ends the niche of the topic you're doing. If you're writing a generic new Normandy history, tons are written on it. You can dive into it fairly easily and explore it. But when you start looking at, say, experiences of soldiers, gender, those sort of topics, also how are you analysing it should be key. But you can find lots of material and then suddenly find nothing. I went through months and months of finding barely anything relevant and this sort of stuff. So expect lots of frustration. But the rewards are massive in terms of what you can contribute. I think what's amazing at the moment, though, is we currently have a large arts fund for creative and performance arts, which incentivises museums and archives to put on art displays. But we don't have anything similar, really, to encourage a good new history emerging, especially because that can challenge our concept of self and who we are as a people constantly. Mates of mine who work on other muted topics throw stuff my way the whole time, and I'm like, how is this not more widely known about? It's really odd. It's a cool thing, I mean, cool stuff's cool. So we want to see more of that, and perhaps more arts funding, and also, I mean, institutions, they should back you. If you're watching this and you're a young historian or you're just an enthusiast interested in your community, and institutions are saying we're not really interested in helping you, your answer should be why, and I'm going to make a fuss, because you have a right to access your heritage, and we're not doing it well enough as a country. So yeah, expect frustration, but the rewards. I mean, this has taken me about 10, 11 years to pull together, and you have to sacrifice. I've had to sacrifice quite a lot to do it. But then at the end of it, I go, am I happy with the end result? Yes. Yeah, I am actually. Does it say something new? It says a lot of new things, which many of them I didn't expect it to say as well. And does it highlight a muted and forgotten narrative? I hate the F word, but yeah. I mean, if you go online now, you should get, I think it's several 100,000 results from what I've put up. So even if you're just interested in a topic, Google it, have a look online, pick some books up, and throw posts up on, don't use Facebook. Facebook's terrible for this. It's really, really awful. Twitter's actually quite good. But then various chat groups and stuff and forums, which are still going, are great ways, because you may just come across the right vector of people you're looking for who may help lead you further. So pursue it. It'll be tough, but it should be rewarding.